Hey, it's me, Moses. Before I start this short podcast, let me say something about myself. I'm a huge fan of D&D or Dungeons and Dragons. I like playing with my friends and watching people play it. I also love this game because it helps me be creative and take criticism from my friends to make a better story and situations for them to be in. A few months ago, I was writing notes for a new game I was going to run for my friends where I was bored and I wanted to watch something, or at least listen to while I was writing notes. So then I saw HBO. Then I saw Lord of the Rings on HBO Max, and I thought, this will actually give me some inspiration. Of course, because it's very fantasy. So I put it on, and through the first movie, I noticed a lot of similarities, and the second one even put more evidence, I guess, best way I could say it. By continuing watching these, I was thinking how far or how much did Lord of the Rings inspire D&D? And that will actually be the topic of this podcast. But before we talk about that, let's talk about the history of Lord of the Rings and D&D. In September 21st, 1937, J.R.R. Tolkien released The Hobbit. And then in July 1954, he released The Lord of the Rings. And I think in a year or 5 months, he released the two other books that was for the trilogy of Lord of the Rings. But these books were not instant hit, and it took some time. It took until the 60s where they became famous and many fans loved the characters, stories, and the setting. A decade later, in the 70s, Dungeons and Dragons was released by Gary Gygax and was popular in the 70s through the 80s. They had a few controversies through these years, but after the 80s, many people stopped caring about this game, and the popularity this went down. But the game still released new additions to Dungeons and Dragons. Years has passed, and then in 2001, the fantasy genre was revived by the first Lord of the Rings movie, again in 2001, was released. Throughout 2001 and 2014, Tolkien's books became movies, and in 2014, the last Hobbit movie was released. In that same year, D&D newest book came out, 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. A year later, a group that will later be called Critical Role recorded themselves playing D&D. Many of their fans love how they interact with each other, the story that the Dungeon Master made up, and they became a hit, causing more people to want to play Dungeons and Dragons. But let's go back to the topic, as we now have the history of, Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons. The similarities that, or at least the influence of Lord of the Rings had on Dungeons and Dragons. In Dungeons and Dragons, or D&D, they have two playable races, dwarves and elves, and both of them follow these kind of like trope, if you want, or trope you call it, where dwarves are prideful, stubborn, and love to mine, and elves are snotty, prideful, and just great with a bow, and also fantastic. And these tropes originated from Tolkien's books, so yeah, it's a definite influence. But that's not all. Back in the 70s, D&D was sued by Tolkien Enterprises for having some of the names from Tolkien's books, such as Hobbit, Ents, and Balrogs. Tolkien Enterprises won, forcing D&D to change the names and made them into Hobbits, Treant, and Balor. Balors? As this, to many fans, to many people, this might be a good enough evidence to say that yes, D&D was the majority of it was definitely inspired by Tolkien, but they are wrong, such as um, because Dungeons and Dragons didn't take all their influence from Tolkien, but a bunch of other fantasy books and movies, if there was any, or stories, as they're not even shameful. They don't find it shameful, but as pride, as they in their newest edition, they will show all their books they were inspired by. As Tolkien's works do have influence, but they're only a surface influence, as much of the more core of D&D was made over the years and based off other great literature. Well, that's my podcast. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.